This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This is the second installment of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity and the African and African American Studies course titled Presidential Politics, Race, Class, Faith, and Gender in the 2008 Election. Tonight's session is titled Representations in the Media and the Message. And the way we're going to proceed tonight is that it's going to be first my honor to introduce our moderator, who will in turn introduce our panelists for the evening. Our moderator is Professor Douglas Foster. Professor Foster is Associate Professor at Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. He has worked in newspapers, television, radio, and online for 30 years. And for more than 5 years, he was editor-in-chief of Mother Jones magazine. He directed coverage of the 1988 and 1992 presidential campaigns, and he is currently at work on a book about young people in post-Mandela, post-Mbeki, South Africa. And I'd like to welcome Professor Foster to the podium.
Good evening. It's great to have a full house at 7 o'clock in the evening. We've got a broad canvas tonight. How race, class, faith, and gender intertwine to shape the candidates, their campaigns, and our society. My brief, and the brief of 4 terrific panelists, is to add something to what you already know about representations in the media, how the campaign has gotten covered so far, where the pivotal moments of the campaign have been captured, how what's at issue has been framed in various media, and even some of the important issues the country must still face that have been left out as the campaign hurtles towards its conclusion. Presidential campaigns in this country reveal aspects of national character and sometimes, as in this campaign, hint at changes underway in patterns of thought, including about identity, questions such as who's considered a real American and who's not. Presidential campaigns also sometimes obscure issues that we find it difficult to discuss directly with one another. One of the things that's been especially fascinating to me this year is that there should be so little real deal discussion of race in a campaign in which the first African American will probably become president of the United States. Except on those occasions when the country has been forced to engage it, as when the clips of the Reverend Jeremiah Wright turned up on YouTube. There's been less discussion for race, at least in my memory. I covered the campaign in 1988 when the Reverend Jesse Jackson ran and lost than there has been in a campaign in which the candidate is likely to prevail. 20 years later, when a black man presented alternately as a post-racial mixed identity man and as an African American, depending on the perspective of the person who's talking, that's one of the complications and nuances that we face. Perhaps the right place for us to start in the discussion tonight, for just a few seconds, is simply to note how much about the relationship between presidential campaigns and media representations of it has changed in a relatively short period of time. The first presidential campaign I worked on as a teenager came in the midst of an economic recession, dramatic shifts within the 2 major political parties, a massively unpopular war, and an upsurge of unprecedented proportions in the activism of young people. Does that sound familiar at all? That was the year 1968, and the candidacy was of Robert F. Kennedy's. The patterns of politicking then and the relationship between candidates and the press seem pretty quaint by comparison to what we face today in consuming news and getting information about the campaign. The bulk of the strategy of any national campaign at that time was to create images and make news by early afternoon in order to dominate the nightly news shows on just 3 network channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and generate a headline in the morning newspapers. Strategists worked on these 2 essential so-called news cycles to generate as much free media as possible in order to complement paid advertising, paid political advertising. That was largely the strategy through 1988 and 1992 when I covered the presidential campaigns of the senior Bush and Michael Dukakis and Bill Clinton and the senior Bush. In other words, let me make this plain. No email, no cable television, no Bill O'Reilly, no Keith Olbermann, no YouTube, no blogs, no Twitter, no Flickr, no iPhone, no Facebook. They're so ubiquitous in our lives today that it's important just to take a second and realize this is all add-on and relatively new. No web, no Daily Show. That show is only 8 years old. No Stephen Colbert. No Tina Fey, unfortunately, with all those wonderful disconnected clauses bumping into one another. Let me make this point in another way by asking you all to signify with a show of hands, particularly the students who are taking the class. How many of you get most of your news online? Okay. How many of you get most of your news from network news shows and daily newspapers? Maybe half a dozen. And how many of you use both? A recent study by the Pew Research Center for People in the Press says that 46% of Americans still get most of their news from the 3 broadcast networks and daily newspapers. They call them the traditionalists. So the students in this room, I know it's no news to you. You don't exactly reflect the rest of the country. About 13% of Americans get most of their news online, what the Pew study calls the net newsers. And about 23% of us get our news through television and online, what Pew calls the integrators, because they use both old and new media. So here's one quick read on those numbers. Among young people, especially more educated and higher income young people, there has been a marked migration away from one-way, highly mediated methods of communication toward less mediated forms that call for more active engagement. The future is going to look much more like the patterns of using news established by your generation than in mine. Here's another way of putting it. When Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992, cable TV was not a factor. And if you asked the question, did you read a newspaper yesterday, 71%, more than 2 of 3, would have said yes. Today, that answer would be 34%, about 1 in 3. The media landscape, especially for young people, who may turn out to be the X factor in the outcome of this race, is far more diverse. The new media spaces young people rely on are more segmented and often more opinion-based than fact-based than broadcast news and daily newspaper coverage of the past. But they're also more interactive and engaging. This year, the new forms have been more influential than in any campaign in U.S. history. Never before have campaigns done so much direct communication online with supporters. Senator McCain fought back from the bottom during the primaries, partly online, and did substantial fundraising there, both in 2000 as well as this year. The Obama campaign has had a masterful strategy in the general election of using new media to go around and past traditional media, not only in fundraising, but in substantive matters as well. Joe Biden's selection as VP was announced by text message and online. The experience with social networking by the Obama campaign for everything from voter registration to online and small in-person gatherings of supporters in the same neighborhood is going to be the subject of lots of PhD theses, books, and provide the basis for national campaigns in the future. In addition to the boost provided by these non-mediated forms of communication, the Obama campaign also faced some distinct challenges online. Posting of a selected few sermons of Reverend Wright created a crisis that might have derailed the campaign in the middle of the primaries and was probably the most influential cause of him losing by such wide margins, 40% in West Virginia, for example, to his primary opponent, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Comments Senator Obama made about how blue-collar voters clung to guns and religion were originally posted on a Huffington Post by a supporter of his, not a professional journalist, based on a fundraiser closed to the media. The outsized effect of posting by an unhinged character by the name of Andy Martin, whose factually wrong but nonetheless persistent claims that Obama is a Muslim and was trained in an extreme form of Wahhabi Muslim faith, had profound effects going viral on the web through the present day, amplifying a sense of conspiracy among anti-Obama groups. But of course, the so-called mainstream media has had its moments in this season too, probing the legislative records of both candidates and the lobbying activities of their staffs, placing both presidential and vice presidential candidates under civil but rigorous questioning that most notably tripped up Republican VP candidate Sarah Palin in a series of interviews with CBS anchor Katie Couric. Maybe the takeaway message is that the 1 in 4 of us who are integrators, what Pew calls integrators, according to the Pew study, have it right because we can check one form of information against another and take advantage of the strengths of each. Those are among the issues we'd like to disentangle and talk about with you tonight. First up is David Perlmutter. He's a professor at the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Kansas. He's a documentary photographer and a specialist in images of war and war making. He's also the author of Blogs War, the New Political Battleground, out just this year from Oxford University Press. He's going to draw from some of the work he did for this book, but also extend it a bit by telling who's in this new space and who's not, and how people of color figure into it. We've asked him to introduce himself in a novel way by playing himself as himself, being interviewed on The Daily Show by Jon Stewart. In a Pew study in 2007, people were asked to name the journalist they admired most. Let me repeat, the journalist they admired most. They named Jon Stewart fourth. So here is a bit of David with Jon.
Thank you very much for letting me join you today. I just wrote this book about politics and blogging, the rise of blogs, and about 3 months ago, 2.5 months ago, I got a call from the Daily Show saying, would you like to be on the Daily Show and talk to Mr. Stewart about your book? And this, for an author, this is a good thing. In case you're wondering, it used to be my fantasy to meet Brian Lamb on C-SPAN, but apparently people just watch the interview and don't buy the book. But so Oprah, Colbert, and Jon Stewart are the big three for if you have a book, and I've got Oprah. I keep waiting for her to call. She hasn't called yet. There was a problem, though, which was 3 years ago. The Daily Show did a segment, more of a sketch on citizen journalism, on the idea that somebody who isn't a professor, isn't a political leader, isn't a journalist, could start something called a blog and say their opinion on the Iraq War or the economy without the usual credentials and without the usual mediated platform of a newspaper. And they completely ridiculed the concept, and the poor professor who'd just written a book on this subject, well, you know, it wasn't a very fun interview for him. So I was a little uncertain, like, am I going to be humiliated on national television? I'm over 40, so being humiliated on national television is not something I seek out, you know. I don't invite Nanny 911 into my home, you know, to see how bad a parent I am. But then somebody else pointed out to me, David, you're not important enough to destroy, which is true. If you watch if you watch the show, they usually do not humiliate ordinary people. They humiliate stars and celebrities, as they should be. So I'm going to just show now the clip. And remember, 3 years ago, Jon Stewart's opinion and the show's opinion was citizen journalism blogging was just ridiculous. Let's see what he thinks now. So I thought that was one bit of evidence that blogging has arrived there as a medium. Now, what I want to talk to you about a little bit today, in line with the subject of this class, is the who of blogging, because that's changed a little bit too, and it's a very important issue, especially as now bloggers have gone within a very short time from a fringe element to a very powerful political element. Really, all the major campaigns have hired bloggers. Blogging, everything I said there is even more true than it was a few months ago. I had an African-American graduate student in 2004 when I was teaching a course on new media then, at that time, say to me that she wanted to do a paper on prominent black political bloggers. And then a couple of weeks later, she came back and said, well, I don't want to do that paper because there are none. And that wasn't exactly, I mean, we talked about it, and it wasn't exactly true. There were some, but there really was an issue about the presence of minority groups or people defined as non-traditional groups within politics and their place within the blogosphere. And the context of this, I'm sorry, we jumped ahead here. The context of this is that, as we're talking about in the introduction, we're in a world where there's certainly a lot of new things that anyone old enough like myself to remember the dream time, the world before, your 100 email messages a day, that wonderful world we lived in. I think it was the Kaiser was ruling Germany or something like that. But what was clear was that my 18-year-old students don't remember that time. My 18-year-old students were born the year the internet became a commercial medium. So none of this stuff is new to them as much as like the wheel and fire. So if I said, text message is a new thing, they would they are confused because they didn't live in this world. But there was a significant point that up through the 80s, we were living in a very controlled political world. And I think that there was a sort of yearning for something else besides the 7-second soundbite, the 7-second visbite. All campaigns were all about message discipline. We have to get our 7 seconds on the evening news to get that free publicity, because the evening news, the three networks really did control most of the people who got political news. And also, there was a sort of focus on horse race. There were a lot of surveys done of news coverage, and they were mostly, unfortunately, as it is now, on like who's ahead in this state and who's ahead in that state, not as much issue coverage. And of course, there was also a strong perception, just as much as now, if you ask a lot of right-wing bloggers why they started blogging, because of left-wing bias to the media. If you ask left-wing bloggers why they invite blogging, usually hatred of Bush and right-wing bias to the media are their top two answers for why they got involved. So there was, I think, societies, there has to, technology is not enough. It's like the Greeks had the steam engine, but they didn't start having trains and things. Their society, maybe slavery was certainly a big part of this, wasn't ready for an industry built around steam. I think we're ready for something like what the internet began. Blogging only started in 1997, the first website that called itself a web log, like a ship's log, diary entries, Captain Kirk's stardate log. And then software came out very quickly. That was really important. Anyone who's old enough to remember putting up a website and trying to update it with new information in 1995, it was basically you had to go hire a technician to do it. But blogging software essentially made anyone able to put up a home page and update it very quickly. So it became a portal for people to want to create their own web page, became very popular. And I think MySpace, YouTube, Flickr, all of these things are sort of sister technologies of online social interactive media. So maybe blogging was the first, but everything else is pretty much related to the form and the format of blogging. Blogging also became famous, as you know, from what I call blog-throughs, events where there was a news event, but also blogging became part of the event, like, say, the South Asia tsunami, where certainly it was a big news event, but also in the news was people taking vacationers, because journalists are never on the scene anymore of journalism. It's ordinary people with their cell phones or their video cameras. So people were putting up their reports, their internet reports, before journalists even got there. And then journalists were buying these reports from the people on the scene. A little profile. Who are bloggers? Well, on any particular day, you can take a snapshot, and there are hundreds of millions of bloggers. The second largest language in the blogosphere is Chinese. The third is Farsi, Persian. A lot of international bloggers. It's rising all over the world. A lot of them, when we do surveys, and I've done my own surveys and with other universities, and the Pew surveys, you can look at them, as mentioned earlier. You do see, at least up till recently, a overwhelmingly white, middle class, upper education, middle education profile. In fact, generally, what I always told people, and you could see this in surveys from other countries, like when they go to Kyrgyzstan or Japan or Poland and do a survey of who blogs there, peasants don't blog. Generally, you go to Poland, the people who blog are pretty much like the people in this room. The majority ethnic group, middle class, tend to be people who have a higher degree of education. But that said, there's even more interesting surveys that are done which show that bloggers demographically and psychographically tend to fall into the category, you probably heard this term from marketing communications and others in commercial marketing, influentials. It used to be called a two-step flow, but basically people who tend to influence other people around them on a particular topic. And that topic can be, home care, you have a friend who's a handyman, or it can be politics. If some people are more influential in small groups and social groups than others. Well, what this means then is that bloggers are not just blogging alone. They may have a community now online, but they also may be people who work and have a community in their own offline community. They also, there's a study done by Forrester's Research in 2005, tend to be tech optimists. That is, people who see the internet and new technology as problem solvers, as places I go to solve a problem. This problem may be, I need more political information. I want to find out Obama's plan for the recovery of the economy. I'm going to go to Obama's website and look it up. I will go see what other blogs are commenting on it. I will go to the internet, in other words, for my solutions. And that's an increasingly large profile of people also fitting blogging. As I said, if you do these surveys, you find overwhelmingly, bloggers are not necessarily a representative cross-slice of the population. This is an interesting statement made by Keith Jenkins, who's an African-American journalist, and he was pointing out something, which was that, just recapitulating what he was saying here, is that it took journalism a long time to integrate. I mean, you could say from the start of the country, it took a couple hundred years for journalism to at least make the effort for the newsroom to look something like the street outside the newsroom. And he raised the issue of what happens when a new technology comes along, and essentially we go back 50 years, at least in the profile of who's involved in the dissemination and the commentary of information on that new technology. In foreign countries, that's very important to notice. There was a case study of this in the Iranian elections a few years ago where if you just read the Iranian bloggers, you were sure that the moderate candidate was going to win. Well, who was blogging? It wasn't the peasants in the countryside who voted overwhelmingly for the very conservative religious candidate. So if you just read the bloggers, you would have gotten a very skewed view. On the other hand, as I often tell my students, vocal minorities, people who are active, as anybody who does anything with city government knows that the world is run by people who show up. And 5,000 people staying at home are trumped by 20 people showing up at the city hall meeting demanding action. And an example of this, enabled by blog, was a couple of years ago. There was a revolution in Kyrgyzstan, partly enabled by blogging. That is, in the country, there were very few avenues for dissent, except through the internet and through blogging. And about 500 people who'd organized themselves online to show up at the presidential palace and demand the new government did. And incredibly, the old government fled, and the new people took over, which is pretty good. The problem is now that apparently a new 500 people show up every Sunday demanding to be the government. So, it only works once, I think, to have a revolution. But vocal minorities who are organized can have that. So the new, I think, of blogging is to look at how a minority group, and it can be intellectual minority, it can be an ethnic minority of any kind, it can be people who are rallying around a particular issue, can have effects. I just was 3 weeks ago at the Blog World Expo in Las Vegas, which is like the business convention of blogging. There are more, I noticed there are more people of color there than had ever been before. They're rising in the blogosphere to more and more influence. There's more, on the right and the left, more attention is being paid. So I think there's some hope there. A lot of minority journalists are turning to blogging after their entry into the newsroom, or finding blogging as a way to find a new audience. I think it's definitely needed. We need more training programs. We need more outreach. We tend, especially in journalism schools, to think traditionally. Although, like in my school, we're doing multimedia journalism. We're teaching blogging and iPodding, but we need to be better in outreaching to minorities to train them in this new technology, and also how to reach an audience. Because if you just blog and only your mother is reading it, is it truly effective? Also, I think it would help if there would be more attention by the mainstream media to what's going on in blogging. There was one missed story, which I have one of my graduate students now is a Native American, and she was pointing out that when Sarah Palin was picked as a vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party, there was a news blip about her husband being of Native American descent, at least partly. I'm not going to exaggerate this as a major story, but there was a huge conversation of this on Native American blogs and on the big discussion blog, IndianZ.com, about the fact that he apparently didn't really get much involved in Native American issues locally. It didn't show up at that tribe's rituals or discussion groups or events. And it would have been an interesting entry point for, maybe we were talking about earlier, as you said, that we're not having a conversation about race, but having a conversation about American Indian issues. That was pretty much ignored. And so as a source of information, that would be really interesting. So in a quick summation, the blogosphere is changing. You're getting more and more people of color, more and more minorities of every description rising in prominence and influence. But just like the newsroom was not integrated by a democratic vote of journalists and editors, it was done basically top down by very aggressive owners and top editors saying, we are going to integrate the newsroom. Blogging is going to need some help, and it's going to need some help from people getting involved in it, but also help from the powers that be in journalism schools and universities, and also in the newsrooms themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And just a reminder to people, if you have questions, pass those cards to the side or to the center, and we'll mix it up with a few questions in between, so we don't have presentation. So if you have questions based on what David said or what Dory is about to say, please pass those down and get them to me. Next up is Dory Maynard. Dory is a former newspaper reporter, and she's president of the Robert C. Maynard Institute of Journalism Education, named for her father, one of the pioneering African-American journalists of our generation. Her mother, Nancy Hicks Maynard, who died a few weeks ago, was another of the pioneers in our profession. She was, among other things, the first black woman reporter at the New York Times. It sort of seems amazing in 2008 to say that, but it tells us something about reflecting back on what David said about how long it took for mainstream newsrooms to begin to make newsrooms look a little bit like the street outside. Her parents, her mother was among the most formidable and admired, even beloved people in our profession, and I remember her and deeply treasure the kind of leadership that she gave us. Dory's parents founded the institute Dory runs in 1977. They were the first African-American owners of a major metropolitan daily newspaper. The institute she runs trains and places non-white journalists in newsrooms around the country. We asked Dory to explain, we heard about some of the newest forms of media, to explain the contradictory signals in old media and new media and the mixed record concerning the commitment to creating diversity in newsrooms, which is important because who's telling the story of this campaign to the American people, how those stories are being framed, and I think the way you put it over dinner was, why are so many reporters clueless about the kind of issues we're here to talk about? Dory.
Well, thank you, Doug. I'm not quite sure I used the clueless word, but there are some challenges. And before I begin, I want to also recognize Steve Montiel, who is another of the co-founders of the Institute and a current board member. So I better do a good job. Sort of contrary to what we've heard about the newspaper industry and the traditional media having finally begun to reflect or to look more like the street, as we've heard, I'd like to give a contrary opinion, which is that I think the traditional media has been very slow to reflect our country. Here we are at a point where the population of our country is comprised of 33% people of color. We have a black man running for the presidency, and about 10 years ago, and I think, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, or don't correct me if I'm wrong, about 10 years ago, the nation's news executives, 2 decades into their efforts to desegregate the nation's news media, got what we call diversity fatigue. And essentially, the efforts to diversify the nation's news media stalled. And since then, on the print side, people of color represent about a little less than 14% of the staff on the nation's newspapers. On the broadcast side, it's a little bit better. People of color comprise a little less than 24% of the staff. Now, if you flip those numbers, what that means is that the nation's traditional news media is between 76 and 86% white. Practically, what that means, for practical purposes, that means that in a community like Newport News, Virginia, that is, the population is, African Americans comprise 39% of the population. What that means is that at that newspaper, in that community, there are no black reporters. What it means from a practical point of view is that the Wall Street Journal sent no journalists of color to cover either convention, and that despite the fact that race has played a central, if not spoken about, role in this election. And what it means is that when the New York Times writes a story about Jesse Jackson's role in the shifting African-American political landscape, it means when the reporter only interviews white sources for that story, it goes unnoted by the reporter and by the myriad editors who have to vet that story until the story is in print and it's pointed out to them at that point. And what it means is when AP runs a story about how race is playing out in the election, and the headline is, "Whites' racial views may swing election." When you read the story, it's not the racial views, it's the racist views. They talk explicitly about the fact that in their poll, they found that many white people have a deep distrust of their African American neighbors. So in essence, what it means is that the very institution that we charge with helping us to make sense of our world, and while the media is changing, a lot of what the bloggers and the new media are using originates in the traditional media. So what it means is that those institutions are not giving us the information that we need to make sense of our world. Now, at the Maynard Institute, our diversity framework is called the Fault Lines Framework, and we look at how race, class, gender, generation, and geography combine to shape our views of ourselves, of each other, and of events around us. And one of the tenets of the Fault Lines Framework says that, we all have blind spots, ways in which our 5 fault lines come together and we don't see something. And so in that sense, it's essential for us to have diversity around us so that if I miss it, my colleague will help me understand it. And that's what's missing from our coverage. Now, it's not the first time we've had this sort of skewed coverage. 40, 50 years ago during the Civil Rights Movement, there were many newspapers in the South that simply declined to cover the civil rights activities because they didn't want to give those people any attention. Now, I'm not saying that this time there's a conscious effort to sort of skew the news, but I think what's happening is there is, because of the blind spots, because of our discomfort with covering race, the mainstream media is skewing those issues, but simply by not covering them. And I think one of the best examples that I've seen recently is the coverage of what's going on around the John McCain's campaign. On the blogosphere, particularly in the blogosphere of color, there's been quite the talk about the way that some of McCain, Palin supporters have been acting recently, and some of the less than civil discourse that's been going on at those campaigns. And the mainstream media, for the most part, has shied away from that story. Until last Friday, when John McCain took the microphone away from one of his supporters who was making disparaging remarks about Obama, and then began to defend Obama. And then the mainstream media chimed in. And they began to cover the story from this frame, which was, there's McCain, he's trying to subdue his supporters, and he's getting booed for it at times. It was almost a, oh, poor John McCain kind of frame. It was not a frame that said, how is he using race? What's going on with some of these comments? And this despite the fact that Representative John Lewis over the weekend also released a statement comparing McCain's tactics to those of George Wallace, the former governor and presidential candidate who essentially rose to prominence by using race. Now, while the mainstream media didn't really tackle that, one of the black bloggers that I really respect did, in fact, not only run all of Representative Lewis' statement, but he also linked to Wikipedia entry on George Wallace, which showed the evolution of Wallace's politics. He had actually started off as a fairly liberal judge, one of the few judges in the South who called the black attorneys who called them Mr. when they came to his courtroom. And then in 1958, he lost the gubernatorial election because his opponent used race and was backed by the Klan. And at that point, the Wikipedia entry quotes him as saying, nobody is going, well, I'm not going to quote what he said, but it essentially said, no one's going to use race, out-race me, let's just put it that way. And so in doing that, what this blogger did and what the mainstream media could have done was use what McCain was doing to explore how we use race in this country. And I think here we are at a point where we're once again potentially reinventing ourselves. And that's a very, very good question for us to look at in this country. How do we use race? What is the role of race in our politics? And yet the mainstream media, because it doesn't have the cultural competency to really address those issues, and it shies away from those issues, missed an opportunity. And I think what it proved is that diversity is not window dressing, as some people in the media have suggested. It is actually a window into the complex communities that make up our country, and it is essential that we, not only in the industry, but I think we in this room insist that the media live up to its obligation to truly reflect what's going on in our country. So thank you very much. Okay, there's another fault line, which is age. And somebody here wrote very small. That would be really helpful. Although I'm quite certain you're older than I am.
A lot has been written about the Bradley effect, or the reverse Bradley effect, in the elections of the 80s and 90s and in the primaries of this year. Given how much has changed in the last 30 years, how do you feel the effects of these phenomena are playing out in the current polls in the presidential election?
I think we'll know on November 5th. I think it's hard to say, because I think that the new media has also changed a lot of what we need to do with polling. I mean, I think we need to be, some has been discussed about the fact that the polls don't use cell phones. And so they're missing some young people, they're missing communities of color, and it's hard to say whether or not that will calibrate against the Bradley effect. My generational point of view says there is a Bradley effect. Again, that's my generational point of view. It's hard to say. I also think, though, that some of the polling may not be getting to other rural areas where that could counterbalance some of the young people. And I don't mean to say it could be this way, it could be that way. I just think that, as usually happens in elections, the media learns more about the electorate and what they missed after the election than they do before the election.
Thanks, Dory. Next up is Steve Montiel, the director of the Institute for Justice in Journalism at the USC's Annenberg School. He's a former reporter and wire service writer, co-founder with the Maynards of the Institute for Journalism Education. He's also been active in politics, serving once as campaign press secretary for Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley, and the Bradley effect we were referring to concerned his run for governor, in which up until the final days of the campaign, he was well up in the polls, if I remember right, by 5% or so, and lost by about the same margin. Yeah. Steve wanted to talk about coverage of two big issues that go beyond presidential campaign coverage, and perhaps maybe even have been submerged in some ways by the way in which coverage of the campaign has been, the way the campaign has been covered so far: immigration and racial issues. Steve.
Let me get, before I start, I know there are the students in this group and then also people from the community. I wonder, let's do it this way. If you were born after 1980, could you raise your hand? And if you were born before 1980, can you raise your hand? How about before 1950? Okay, thanks. That helps me to know the audience. Well, the horse race aspects of this presidential race have dominated the media narrative, whatever the platform, traditional, the internet, cable, or talk radio, especially regarding race, gender, and class. And given past media performance, that's no surprise. So what is there to learn about media treatment of complex, contentious issues? The kinds of issues that would benefit from presidential leadership and responsible media representation. One way to look at media representations of this presidential campaign, especially with the candidacy of a black man whose father was foreign born, is to consider how U.S. media have covered two complex, contentious issues: immigration and race relations. Race, gender, and class have all been addressed, however imperfectly or superficially, through all media platforms during the presidential campaigning of the past 20 months. Immigration as an issue figured prominently in the Republican primary campaigns, and Barack Obama spoke about both immigration and the complexities of race relations in America during the Democratic primary season. But since the party conventions, immigration has been noticeably absent from media news coverage and commentary, reflecting decisions by both the Obama and John McCain campaigns to steer clear of this volatile topic. The San Francisco Chronicle used the silence of the candidates as the peg for a page one story today that compares the differences of their approaches to immigration. The story reported that despite the harsh rhetoric of recent years, some observers believe there is broad-based support for the comprehensive immigration overhaul that both candidates generally favor. A report on the media and the immigration debate released last month by the Brookings Institution and USC Annenberg's Norman Lear Center also noted that while all media sectors have focused on strongly felt views at either end of the policy spectrum, the broad middle in American public opinion favors a mix of policy options. But that segment's views are marked by uncertainty and anxiety about the topic and skepticism about government's ability to handle it. In the words of the report, this reflects the way the immigration narrative has been framed by the media. USC Annenberg journalism professor Roberto Suro wrote in the executive summary for that report that the traditional journalism narrative has produced, in his words, a narrative that conditions the public to associate immigration with illegality, crisis, controversy, and government failure. Meanwhile, he said, new media voices of advocacy, again in his words, have succeeded in mobilizing segments of the public in opposition to policy initiatives, sometimes by exaggerating the narrative of immigration told by traditional news organizations. Suro concluded, again in his words, whether intended or not, the message of this narrative is that immigrants have provoked a crisis in public policy that is disassociated from any underlying social, demographic, or economic trends. The media's failure to adequately provide context for the policy challenges has produced both lack of understanding and frustration with government's inability to resolve them. For anyone interested in the intersections of policy, public opinion, and media, it's worth taking the time to read the full report online. The report is called Democracy in the Age of New Media, and it's available at the Brookings Institution website. It's about 90 pages long, but it's got a lot more detail than I'm able to go into here, and it tells us a lot about the relationship between media and public opinion. Another worthwhile report released by the Opportunity Agenda this past summer also looks at media narratives and framing having to do with affirmative action, which, like immigration, has been off the political radar screen. Like the immigration report, this one characterizes media coverage of race-conscious programs, race-conscious remedies for discrimination as episodic and conflict-oriented. It's available at the Opportunity Agenda website, which you can find by Googling the Opportunity Agenda. The Opportunity Agenda's media content analysis found that media coverage conveys a picture of a country divided over whether or not discrimination still exists, and divided over what the roles and responsibilities of government and private actors should be if it does exist. The dominant media frames identified by the report, called affirmative action in the public discourse, make up a three-part narrative. First, race-conscious measures like affirmative action programs have outlived their usefulness and are no longer needed. Second, race-conscious measures are divisive. And third, there are other less divisive ways of creating diverse campuses and workplaces, such as using class. According to the report, none of the news articles in state and local news outlets that were part of the content analysis explored how affirmative action bans, if adopted, affect minority college admissions, minority contractors, or equal employment practices. I mentioned this report, the Opportunity Agenda report, because like the immigration report, it explores the impact of mass media framing and episodic, non-contextual coverage on public opinion and public policy. And because Barack Obama's presidential candidacy raised hopes among advocates for race-conscious programs that he would use his standing to move the public on issues such as affirmative action. He hasn't, but there has been plenty of media attention to race, especially lately. There's already been mention of the Bradley effect, and there was a pretty good comprehensive piece in the New York Times, on the Sunday New York Times, looking at this from a number of different perspectives. I recommend that. Also, CNN did a show last night looking at race in the Bradley effect and various aspects of that. I was disappointed in the CNN piece because I thought it ignored any systemic issues having to do with race as a factor in this election. But it was the whole program. New York Times is looking at it. I think it's getting a lot of attention now. Three concluding points. There's no doubt that there's a very direct connection between media coverage and public perception, behavior, and attitudes. Whatever the platform, the narrative and framing influence public dialogue and public policy. Second, this is nothing new. It's a continuation of narratives that have misportrayed the other for decades, centuries. We have all this new media, but it's the same old story. Even though we've got such historic things happening in this campaign season, particularly in terms of race and gender, it's still the same story, but potentially worse. Less factual, in some cases more partisan, viral, 24/7. So it's tough to feel optimistic as we look to the future and hope for more context. Moving forward, this is the last point I'll make. I think all of us share the responsibility for the quality of the public discourse and the quality of news media, news coverage, blogging, and so I think, and we at the Institute for Justice and Journalism believe that new forms of support for journalistic context using new technologies to go beyond what's been achieved is really going to be important in future years. How this is going to break out, I don't know that anyone knows, but we need more context, not less. And I think what Doug Foster talked about earlier, the integrators, I think are going to play a key role in this, people who are using all media. Thank you. The question is, what are the roots of the opponent sentiment in the mainstream media that we live in a post-racial era? Is this the case? What are the roots of the apparent sentiment in the mainstream media that we live in a post-racial era? Is this the case? Well, I don't think we're anywhere near a post-racial world. That phrase is often associated with not just Barack Obama's candidacy, but with Barack Obama. And Obama himself has said that he doesn't consider the country post-racial. I think that there is a tremendous desire, particularly among people who don't have to deal with race every day. Among white Americans, I think there's a tremendous desire that we would be a post-racial society. But we're not there yet, and I think it can be dangerous to deny the racial dynamics that are at play in the country. I think we do that at our own risk, and it's been a long time since that's led to violence, but for the sake of the people born before 1980, in the 1960s we had rioting in 100 cities across the country, and there was a commission set up to look at the causes of that violence, and the commission blamed the media for not portraying the realities of everyday life to all Americans, and to not having integrated news staffs that could help with that reporting. So I don't think it's the case, and I think that the roots of the apparent sentiment in the mainstream media that we live in a post-racial era is wishful thinking.
The fourth panelist is Sally Lerman, a science journalist and professor at Santa Clara University. She's a contributor to, among other things, Scientific American, Nature, Health, Salon.com, and NPR. She's not only an integrator, but an integrative journalist. She crosses platforms. She's going to help us understand aversive racism, the discriminatory patterns among people who do not think of themselves as subject to racist patterns of thinking, and how these patterns affect those in the media who frame and report the news, as well as readers, viewers, bloggers, interactive online participants who receive that information. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, and thank you, Doug. I love that term, the integrator. Okay, so I wanted to talk with you tonight about the things that Doug mentioned in the context of some of the reading I've been doing this summer. I've been looking at mainstream media, looking at online media in terms of broadcast and blogs, and the ethnic media. So what are the stories that are told, why, and how does that affect the way we think about this campaign? And one of the things that you need to know, I think, in order to think about the way political coverage is operating right now in the context of race, is that newsrooms typically operate under a beat system. And due to the efforts that Dory was describing earlier, and Doug was as well, newsrooms have tried to reflect their communities better. And one of the things they've done is assign certain people to that job. So there were community beats, there are beats of people who are assigned to try and figure out what race is in our society and then reflect it better in our pages, as well as some newspapers, not very many, had women's beats. But now we have political reporters covering these areas. And so they may not think they're covering it, but it is, race and gender are essentially implicit in every single story that is done about this campaign because of the candidates. And I think in order to understand that, not only do you have to think about the beat system, but about the kind of coverage overall that we're seeing in the news and that we have seen in the news over time. And that is, as you've heard, journalists generally don't cover race or the way race operates in society very well. So my question was, okay, if that's the case, then what's happening in political coverage? You heard from Dory, let's see, oops, what do I point at? Oops, going too fast, sorry you guys. So you heard from her about the newsrooms, what our newsrooms will look like and the difficulties that we've had in integrating our newsrooms. This is just a number to show you that 392 newspapers across the country have no people of color at all covering the news, which is 42% of the people, just the people that responded to the survey. There are a lot of newsrooms that didn't even respond to the survey. So that gives you a sense of who's covering the news, and as a result, what kinds of stories journalists see and who they go to for information. So who are the sources that we go to? What kinds of questions do we ask? And as a result, then, who gets to tell the broader story of what's happening in this country? And almost every survey that I've seen or study on content and sourcing has come up with only about 11% people of color as sources in the news. And the number that is white can range anywhere from about 60% to 90%, depending on how strict you are in evaluating who's who. So pretty much there have been a lot of arguments by people who do media analysis that we really are in an era where we still have what they call white news, about white people, by white people. And so that is the environment in which we're seeing this political coverage. And it matters. It matters a lot. And there's been a lot of research done in communication studies and political studies, experimental psychology, about what is the effect of this type of news, including some very good work, excellent work here done at Stanford. So there's this growing literature that this sort of portrayals that we see contribute to the kinds of stereotypes that we live with, the kinds of understandings that we have with one another. So I just want to show you one study as an example. This study was done at UCLA. Whoops, sorry, one ahead. This study was done at UCLA, and it was done, Frank Gilliam at UCLA and Chantal Yengar here at Stanford did a study where they invited about 2,300 residents of Los Angeles to look at news stories. And what they did, it was the same exact news stories, but about crime, but they varied who the perpetrator was. And they did just to show a picture of the perpetrator. Sometimes it was a black perpetrator, sometimes it was a white perpetrator, sometimes there was no perpetrator. And what was so interesting about the results is 44% of the time, when there was no perpetrator in the news story, people saw one, they remembered one. And guess what color that perpetrator was? Yeah, so the perpetrator was black. And not only that, so these were some of the results that they saw, which was one so they would see the black perpetrator, and in the stories where they saw a black perpetrator, because there actually was one in there, then their political attitudes changed. So there was this sense that punitive remedies were more appropriate for in the criminal justice system. And in addition, they found this trend that people who watched news a lot, any kind of network news or local news, tended to have attitudes that they termed new racism. And new racism is this type of racism that you could think of as racism gone underground. So a denial that discrimination still occurs, and a sense that perhaps black people and brown people make illegitimate demands on the system and are getting special favors. So the people that were watching news were thinking those things. This is the kind of context in which campaign coverage occurs. And Travis Dixon, who's a very highly regarded researcher in this area, says that more than a quarter of stereotypical beliefs can be explained just by how much news you watch. So I thought that was a pretty powerful statement. So what I want you to do, thinking about that context, and I could show you a lot more examples, but thinking about that context kind of just take you through a little journey through the kinds of coverage that we've seen, and some of this has been discussed already. So first of all, we heard about the post-racial candidate. It's somebody asked him one of the questions. And of course, Daniel Shore could say this a lot better than I could, but he was talking about the coverage that was describing Obama himself as post-racial and this climate in America that was post-racial. And he says, the post-racial era, as embodied by Obama, is an era in which civil rights veterans of the past century are consigned to history, and Americans began to make race-free judgments on who should lead us. So, and this kind of coverage really emerged from the media because, as Steve was saying, this is not how Obama was describing itself. So, but in fact, it does reflect this kind of attitude of racism gone underground. It's not overt that often, at least especially in places like California, but instead it operates in our subconscious, in our unconscious. Journalists, especially those who aren't familiar with thinking about these things, tend to think in that same way, and rarely will think about or write about the operation of racism in this country as a system, as in a series of systems that interact with one another, such as educational opportunities, the criminal justice system, schooling, all the variety of effects that healthcare that give privilege to certain segments of society. Except with the notable exception of the New York Times race series, the CNN's Black in America series, and a Boston Globe series about 10 years ago. So next up, we had, is he black enough? So it's a post-racial society, but then we wanted to know if he was black enough. This came out of a couple of black columnists' concerns that Obama didn't focus enough on black civil rights concerns. But the media didn't go there. The news media didn't start asking about what are these civil rights concerns. In fact, there was a New York Times poll that talked about the racial divide and how black people and white people and Hispanics think differently about race issues. But I didn't see a lot of coverage of that. Instead, there was this questioning of Obama himself. It was essentializing what race is in an individual. Next thing, oh no, he's too black, based on the Reverend Wright's talk that came out. So again, race becomes more and more essentialized, and it's sort of a reflexive way of thinking that a lot of psychologists have identified that is embedded in us from the very moment that we start becoming acculturated, as a baby, essentially. And so Obama tried to counteract that, but with his race speech, and trying to make race concrete and attempting to raise the rhetorical stakes for all of us by talking about the complexity of our history in this country. Unfortunately, the media didn't take the bait. Instead, the media started thinking, okay, well, we'll just avoid the subject. And so you saw mistakes like this, or leaks like this, I guess I would call it, like the New Yorker cover, where they were trying to portray Obama as a Muslim and his wife as a black, Michelle, his wife, as a black revolutionary in an attempt at satire. Of course, there was a lot of outrage about this cover, but the mainstream media primarily was asking questions about, after the outrage, was it funny? Was it really satire? Or even, was it racist? Finally, can you make jokes about black people? Is that forbidden area? So the emphasis was on consequences and the institution itself, the New Yorker. And that's important because the way media frames stories also affects the way we think about them. If we think about them as individual problems, if we think about them as an institutional issue, it's less often that we would then go to, well, what are the systems in society that bring us here? What is the operating factors behind here? But speaking about the different types of media that are involved in this story, the Ebony Jet online had this incredible historic illustration with a headline, "Can a Cartoon Change Minds?" And this is the Freedmen's Bureau, and it has this grotesque figure of a black man essentially trying to scare whites into thinking that black people will then take power, and really essentially trying to scare people. So this is what was happening. So in the online black blogosphere, as well as in black magazines, is people were trying to take this story a little deeper and asking, what does this tell us about the way African Americans have been treated historically in this country? Some people even wrote stories about the struggles of white illustrators to try to show Obama in an interesting way without leaning on stereotypes. But that passed quickly. And the Reverend Wright story elicited things like this, which was a conversation about race with an entirely white panel. So this was the kinds of things that we were seeing. Very earnest discussion. And I also think it's important to talk about the other groups and how they were portrayed, whether they were portrayed. Asians were pretty much entirely left out of this whole conversation. Latinos were described as this monolithic group that would make one decision or another. Will the Latinos go for Obama or won't they? And I think I wanted to show you these two stories because, my pointer, I haven't figured it out yet. There we go. So as this story was written in the Austin American-Statesman, so a Texas newspaper that has to think a lot about covering Latino issues, and they talk about how the Latinos as a group are pretty much impossible to pin down. This is a very diverse demographic group. But then here at USA Today, it's all about the battle for the Hispanic vote, as if everybody in this room, if we were all Hispanic, then we could be sure that we would all vote the same way. And that's probably a more typical way of covering it. And then the other thing that we saw, let's see, I don't know if I have a, whoops, I jumped way ahead. Can you help me with that? Sorry. So I'm almost at a close here, but the other two, I guess, themes that we heard were this idea of betrayal. This kind of came up in the last week or so, that Obama is now going to force us to talk about race, and so, but we really resent that. And then finally, in this last week, we've also seen accusations of racism against McCain and Palin, but there's been a lot of harsh reaction against that in the conservative blogosphere, as well as on television networks like Fox News, because of this idea that you told us we didn't have to talk about race, now we have to, and now you're accusing us of racism. So, but the reason why I think we're seeing this sort of trajectory is because there's been this lack of attention to the way race operates in the United States and how that may affect the campaigns overall and how that may affect the vote. We've been helping to, as journalists, we've been helping to create this climate of denial. We've been perpetuating this view that racism is an overt one-on-one type of activity, not a bias that can reside in anyone, and actually does. So what are the unconscious stereotypes at play that could hurt Obama? And I've just listed these up above here because these are the kinds of things that in surveys, public surveys, emerge, whether perhaps people are testing your unconscious responses to certain images or finding other ways to test how people think or respond to imagery. And the idea that it's very hard for people to associate, for white people to associate blacks with the word American, and people of other races also find it a little bit harder if they have to associate black people with the word American as opposed to some other terms that wouldn't be seen as American. Black versus competent, that's another one that's, especially when it comes to politicians, that in our subconscious we often carry with us. Black is criminal dangerous, I already talked with you about that. And black equals arrogant. So if you think of the type of coverage that we've been seeing over the last, year and a half, I guess, of the Obama campaign, and some of the accusations that have been leveled against him, and some of the concerns that have been leveled against him that we're now seeing rise again, I think you can see how just our overall lack of attention in the media to this area has helped cultivate that. Because we've generally avoided race, unless we're forced to confront it, we've helped create the climate for some of the ugliness that we've seen in the last week or so. Furthermore, we may be biasing the election by pushing everyday unconscious racism underground. We've helped create an environment where unconscious bias is easily activated. So thank you.
Chair. So we're going to get through as many of the questions that have come from you as possible. I just want to take the privilege of the moderator and say hi to Kim Cranston. One of the things I didn't mention that I did as a reporter was a documentary on the final Senate race of Kim's dad, Alan Cranston. It's good to see you. Let's get right into one of the subtexts that was running through some of the comments, and particularly in what David said and what Steve said. Question comes from the floor. The internet, while allowing for a rapid exchange of ideas, also is a hotbed for inflammatory and irresponsible vitriol that can be hidden behind the veil of anonymity. What can be done to make the blogosphere a more responsible partner in election coverage? And there was a little bit of a tension between what the two of you said, so let's get into it.
Tension? No, there's not.
Okay.
Yeah, there's been research really since the early days of bulletin boards that there's something about staring at a screen instead of another human being that you are more likely to say something unfortunate. Let's put it that. And as somebody who's written a lot of newspaper op-eds, and I get the most vicious email, and then I'll write the person back, and within a couple of exchanges, they're being civil. And they just shot off, and there's no interlocutor between the brain and the keyboard. And blogging has unleashed that. On the other hand, I'm not willing to say that the internet has made us more partisan or more divided, as some people have, because I always ask the question, more partisan and divided than when? 1968, 1865? I mean, we have been partisan and divided. In fact, for those of you who've read the best book about democracy in America by de Tocqueville, he talks about the fact coming here in the 1830s and being shocked at how vicious Americans were in their politics, and that was a long time ago. So I think there's a context there that, yes, blogging and these other new media have enabled a lot of partisanship and division and hatred. On the other hand, we seem to have accomplished it with older technologies as well.
Steve, do you want to come back?
Well, just to start in agreement really with David, I see blogging as a great opportunity to diversify the voices and opinions and information that we receive. Dory Maynard talked about the failure of mainstream media to fully integrate. That's an effort that's been going on for a long, long time. And so it's going to be a long time, if ever, before we see mainstream media fully integrated. So with blogging and the blogosphere, there's the opportunity to get this diversity of voices without having to rely on mainstream media to provide that diversity of voices. What I worry about, though, is where will we get in-depth contextual stories and commentary that are at least attempt to be nonpartisan, where there's some attempt to be measured and to take into account diversity of perspectives. There are, even though mainstream media, traditional media has been deficient in doing this on a regular basis, really any day of the week we can find examples of really great journalism, stories and commentary that really do help people understand complex, contentious issues. And it's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally, that takes some education to do. And so the question that I would have, looking at the blogosphere of the future, and citizen journalists, almost journalists, there are different terms for the non-traditional journalists who there's just no doubt are going to be playing a big role in the future. Are there ways that non-traditional journalists can incorporate journalistic values and journalistic standards into their work, and is there a way to make this happen by design rather than leaving it to chance?
Sally, did you want to get in?
I wanted to add to that because there's one type of media that we really haven't talked about tonight, and that is the talk shows. And they are having a very powerful influence on the kinds of conversations that we have in this country. And it's one of the things that I looked at over the summer, and the rhetoric, particularly on the right-wing talk shows, which is most of them, I did look at the numbers, are using very inflammatory language, using a lot of labeling and derogatory terms, and and part of it is an entertainment vehicle, but trying to get the audience stirred up. So the question is, how much of that then gets pushed onto the web and into the blogosphere? And the other thing I did was look at the conservative and the liberal blogs, and some of the conservative blogs did have this sort of name-calling and sort of flame-throwing that really does not enable conversation very well. And to be honest, I also saw that on some of the more liberal websites. So it's can journalism help influence the blogosphere more toward looking at a variety of perspectives and bringing them in, or will it move more toward the talk show kind of environment where you get a big audience, but what kind of conversation are you really having?
Question maybe for Dory to start us out on. Do you feel that Obama will be held more to his campaign promises partly due to his race? If so, could a mediocre Obama administration set back minorities?
Well, one of the things that the founders, is this on? That the founders of the Institute used to say is, we know we have arrived when we have the same right to have mediocre journalists as our white counterparts do. I think that given some of the enormous challenges facing whoever wins this election, I think that there is going to be, to some extent, some understanding that they really do face challenges that the previous administrations did not face. Having said that, I still find it interesting, as has been pointed out, that we have just finished 2 terms of a president who is universally viewed as less than inept. And we're still questioning the qualifications of Obama. And I think in that context, I think you have to say race is certainly playing a role.
Anybody else on that question? The next question is, are Saturday Night Live and The Daily Show capable of affecting the outcome of this election?
I hope so. Yes, I mean, you can make that qualitatively and quantitatively. Yes, quantitatively, you see, as you pointed out in your introduction, the gradual erosion that is now heavy bleeding of the traditional sources of news. You see the average age of the CBS Evening News, where Katie Couric is a young hottie, and that's why they cast her there. Then you see the leading sources of news for a lot of people, 18 to 24, The Onion, Jon Stewart, some other websites. So there's a shift going on. I used to teach sort of journalism 101. They have 400 people in the room, and they'd say, how many of you read a daily newspaper? And they'd start to raise their hand and say, that's not the student newspaper. And then all the hands would go down except 2 strange students who wanted to go into journalism or something like that. And it really has changed. So yeah, that's where the news is. And I'll say this, in defense of both of those institutions, they do their homework. They pay attention. I mean, we haven't gotten into it yet. If journalism is dying, I believe it's a murder-suicide pact, and journalism is doing enough damage to itself. It doesn't need anybody else coming in and assisting in the suicide.
One of the questioners about The Daily Show quoted from the New York Times, the producer is saying, if we are the most trusted source of news for young people, then it's because of a void that's been left by others, and that sort of dovetails with what you're saying. Here's a challenge from one student. If reporting is supposed to be objective and fair, what does skin color of the reporter matter? And considering that McCain hasn't even mentioned race in this campaign, how can you claim McCain is race baiting? It doesn't tell us who it's directed to, and I don't know if anybody wants to take it up.
Well, I'll take the first part, and I think I got at that earlier, which is that our race, our class, our gender, our generation, and geography really do shape how we see things. And the idea of objective was really an interesting idea, but it's a notion that I think we in journalism have decided doesn't really work. Nobody is objective. We all bring into a story sort of our past baggage, our past history, and that's how we tend to view it. If you take a very old example, which is O.J. Simpson, all the polls showed that, let's just take gender, white women and black women viewed that case very differently. White women tended to think that O.J. Simpson should have gone to jail. Black women tended to think that O.J. Simpson shouldn't have gone to jail. If you looked beneath sort of the race, a lot of it had to do with what our experience had been with the criminal justice system. It wasn't that black women thought because he's black he shouldn't go to jail, or that even white women thought because he's black he should go to jail. It was that again, our race had shaped how we had interacted with this criminal justice system, which had worked primarily for most white people and had not worked primarily for most black people. It was several years after O.J. Simpson was acquitted that we found out in a real systematic way what the police department, the Los Angeles Police Department had been doing, and in terms of its treatment of primarily African Americans. So what race does is it shapes what's happened to us, which shapes how we see it, which is why we need to have as much diversity in covering all issues. And that's the only way we're going to get at the nuances and the multiplicity of viewpoints of these issues.
I'll take the second one.
Okay.
Okay. So at least I wasn't accusing McCain of race baiting. And I guess some people have, but I don't think he needs to race bait because of the climate that we've created or because of the understandings that we create in the media. And so all he has to do is say, like in the first debate, Barack Obama doesn't understand, as he repeated, or I guess that was the second debate, repeated over and over. And now it's the question, who is Barack Obama? So those play right into those questions that we hold about one another in a very deep, unconscious way, but never voice. So who is this man? Is he Muslim? Is he black? Is he mixed race or biracial? Who is he? And also this idea of black politicians, which has been a very historic way of thinking about black politicians in surveys as being not as competent as white politicians. So all he has to do is remind us, and it's already there in our minds.
Yeah, 1995, I was teaching at Louisiana State University, which is Baton Rouge, and another professor and I, we did exit polls of a gubernatorial election. It was a white Republican versus a black Democrat. And we were very gratified to find that practically no one was voting based on race. That's what they told us. And there's a phenomenon in polling called socially desirable answers. But that in itself is interesting because in the survey, one of the questions we asked was the standard question was, if you voted in the last gubernatorial election, who did you vote for? Now, the last gubernatorial election in Louisiana, for those you might remember, was David Duke was the candidate. None of our black students, by chance apparently, happened to meet one person who had voted for David Duke, even though David Duke won about 53% more of the white vote. That was interesting because even people who voted for David Duke couldn't bring themselves to say face-to-face, not over the internet, but face-to-face to a black person that I had voted for David Duke. So we've entered an era of more nuance, and I think people on both sides know that if you just make a direct racial attack, that is just the blowback will be much greater than any benefit. So of course it's going to be nuance, and you see that in Obama campaign ads, which are among the least integrated TV ads there, and that's a very conscious strategy, and it's a very smart political strategy, and it's easy for professors like me to say, well, we should have a conversation about race, but if the Obama campaign is interested in winning, which is what they're interested in doing, they have a different mind to this.
Question, why do you think Asian Americans have been left out of the discussion?
Numbers, very small numbers, but in fact, when I was talking with my colleague this morning about this conversation, who happens to be Asian American, and we were sort of going through the fact that we were just, very few Hispanic reporters are covering this. There's very little, as Steve, you pointed out, about issues pertaining to Hispanic people. And I said, and I don't think there's anything about Asian Americans. And my colleague said, there never is. I mean, that really, Native Americans and Asian Americans tend to get the least amount of coverage when it comes to political issues, unless it's around affirmative action.
Anybody else? How, if at all, are women represented in the blogosphere? Are there outreach programs to incorporate women since it's more representative of male voices?
Well, just in numbers, they're growing at the fastest rate probably of any other group, and you can certainly see there's really two, in the terms of political blogosphere, that's one thing. We always have to remember that political blogging is actually a small slice of the pie of blogging. There are entire other areas such as it's called mommy blogging by the bloggers themselves, so that's not a term of derision, blogging about family issues, and there you have a dominance of women. In political blogging, you see a lot of the top political bloggers are female, and the numbers are growing. So I think it was one of those early adopter issues that now it's sort of caught up. But I do want to say one thing about that, and this is referring to a previous question. The viciousness that can get in there in blogging is an inhibiting factor to some groups to join, and I've found this, that I used to have my students, as part of their assignment in the class, to put up their own blog. I no longer do that. I let them blog on my blog, and if they want to blog, I allow them to have a pseudonym, because they would, especially the female political bloggers, would get the worst attacks in email, much more so than the male bloggers, and that's an issue. It's got to be, you know, I mean, who wants to open themselves up to hatred and attack? Yeah.
How could McCain have let his internet presence, and for that matter, most younger generation forms of communication, get so far behind compared to Obama?
I apologize for dominating. I'm sorry. A couple months ago, I visited a student of mine who works for McCain. I teach political communication, so a lot of my students go on into politics. And I visited him, and then we had dinner. I visited him at McCain headquarters, which is in Washington, which is 4 or 5 stories of an office building. And by the time he and his wife and I, who went to pick up, got there, it was about 7:30 at night, and everybody who looks like me had gone to bed or had gone to dinner, and the building was full of hundreds of 24-year-olds, which is the bulk of any campaign. If you go to Obama headquarters at that time, you'll see the same demographic, because they're the ones who can work 18 hours. And my student does web videos for McCain, but most people agree that the left has temporarily at least won the battle of new media, that the Obama campaign has been much more skillful in exploiting all these new media venues. Partly, I think it was an issue of when the people who are out of power for a long time are more willing to try new things. So we'll see what happens when, if there's a sweep of Congress and the presidency, and the conservatives feel that they're out of power, see what they embrace.
Anybody else?
Well, I just want to add to that. I guess that the conservative bloggers are very strong. They don't rank as the most popular, but you can find them in the top 10. And there's a very lively conversation going on in that part of the blogosphere. I think if you're interested in politics, the best thing to do is look at the variety. Try to read your conservative blogs and your liberal, and look at the black blogosphere and the Latino blogosphere. And there you find some very strong emerging voices, like jackandjillpolitics.com. And they say that's directed toward the black community, but they say at least 30% of their readership is white, because people want to learn about that. There's another one called Latino Pundit that you could look up, and several Latino-oriented, or Latinalista is another one as well. And those, interestingly enough, you see more women blogging there than you do in some of these other political sites that are more considered dominated by white bloggers. So there is some kind of bubbling up of variety happening on the web that's very useful to look at if you want to get more a sense of what the conversation is going on around the country.
Why, if we're seeing a democratization of media forms and expansion of voices, is the discussion limited to 2 major political parties? Why don't the new forms promote diversity of view in terms of 3rd, 4th, 5th party candidates?
We're journalists, not political scientists.
They're good questions.
I want to say, yeah, Obama's campaign is actually an example of that. I go back to Howard Dean, because I'm a political communication person. I always I try to be in Iowa in 2003s and the 3s, in the years before elections. Dean tried some great new things. No new technology works the first time, but their concentration really was, and their skills really were online. It really showed you have to do both. The Obama campaign figured that out. They've got top people doing their get out the vote, their voter canvassing, their polling, their advancing. They've got all good people doing the regular old stuff of politics, and also they've got hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think that's really the key, is that you can't just do it on the cuff in their basement and win the presidency. You still need those hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in the large, large organizations that the parties have.
Anybody else? I was struck, in the Pew studies at how low the credibility is, not just for mainstream media, but across the board. You don't get above 20, 21, 22% kind of, I have a high level of faith that most of what I'm seeing on this outlet is probably true. Does anybody want to talk about that? Why in the most changed media landscape that we've had do we see this kind of ceiling on the willingness of people to trust that even a collection of sources is probably telling the truth most of the time?
I think that's because we don't really get a collection of sources in any one form of media. I think it gets back to the diversity issue. And as we become much more diverse, and our media, no matter what the outlet, still becomes much more niche, we're not going to trust it. If I don't see myself reflected accurately and fairly, how am I going to trust you as a media to reflect anyone accurately and fairly? And if I don't see myself accurately and fairly reflected in any case, why am I going to bother to read you, watch you, or listen to you? And I really think that in some cases it's just that simple.
Can we roll things forward a little bit? The question is, in the next 8 years, how different will the role of the media be in politics, and who will drive that change most? I was thinking, as David and Steve were talking about, the fact that our discussion has mostly been about how these new forms changed our view of the campaign and changed what happened in the campaign. But what is the fact that so much politics has been part of, at the center of so much of what's been taking place in new media, but also in old media? The coverage, the intensity of the coverage, the intensity of the involvement in 2008 is certainly greater than in 2004 and 2000. So is there a reverse dynamic? Is the blogosphere going to be changed? Are newsrooms going to be changed by the fact that there was this unprecedented engagement, at least so far, in the campaign? Thoughts about that?
Well, I'll start off on that. Really from the old media perspective. I started working in newspapers when it was still hot type back in 1967, and try as I will, I'm studying. I'm trying to get with it on the blogosphere, and bit by bit I'm getting there. But I'm rooted in traditional media, some people call it legacy media, and I think one form of old media that I think is not going to go away, is going to get stronger when it comes to politics is television. It's not going to go away. It's the most powerful medium anywhere. How it evolves in relation to the internet remains to be seen. But when we look at this election, it's television. That's the advertising is going to television. The debates are getting big audiences, and so I think the evolution to watch is where TV goes and how it gets incorporated into web-based media, and newspapers. Newspapers have the greatest capacity to really dig into an issue, to a set of issues, to dig into complexity, and yet, as we all know, they're being diminished almost daily, certainly weekly, fewer and fewer resources at daily newspapers. So that's the big question mark is what about daily newspapers? It's all, as you know, Doug, it's been, for some time, newspapers haven't had the influence that they used to. Editorial endorsements in newspapers don't carry a whole lot of weight. But they have been able to bring a depth and a context that other media haven't been able to bring, and I think that that's going to be a gap that has to be filled for the sake of democracy.
Doug, I think there's one wild card in here that I think we all need to be really aware of, and I think we cannot predict the future engagement, media engagement, without thinking about what happens if there's another terrorist incident, depending on who becomes the next president. I mean, we saw in 2002, after 9/11, the media self-censored itself to the point where about a year after the war began, that people, all three the presidents of the news networks here at Stanford admitted that they did a terrible job in covering the run-up to the war because they were engaged in self-censorship. So I think that that's something that could occur again, and that we in this room need to be more vigilant about the next time and make sure that the media does not engage in any self-censorship, no matter the incident, no matter who takes office.
Well, I'm going to be the voice of optimism because I see there are a lot of, I'm around a lot of newspaper people a lot of the time, and there's a lot of depression out there because of what's happening to print media. And yet there's so much foment and creativity and questioning that it's a great opportunity for journalism to try and change and adjust. And at the same time, audiences are arguably more engaged than in many years. There's a lot of interest in news, and we owe a lot of that to new vehicles of distribution, and a lot of this news that people are getting on the internet is still produced from newspapers, not entirely, or broadcast. So there's more exchange, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of questioning and creativity, and so I think that, and pushback from the audience, I think that we could see some very interesting new things emerge that would benefit democracy overall.
Just in technology, you're seeing the next generation of television sets are also essentially going to be screens for your computer. So the line between watching television and watching YouTube wants to be a television network. I mean, and so they see themselves now as a version of that. So it's not going to be clear anymore that whether you're watching TV or your cell phone or a computer screen. I'll say also in response, one interesting phenomenon, we tend to think of political bloggers as arguing about the Iraq War and big issues, but because newspapers and local radio, TV are cutting back so much on the coverage of just life in a particular city, the sewer board, things like that, that it's almost like the dinosaurs pulling back and these little mammals coming out and into these evolutionary niches. And you're seeing bloggers, local bloggers, not national bloggers, local bloggers saying, nobody in my town is covering water issues anymore because the paper won't spend money to have a water reporter like they used to. And so I'm going to cover water issues. And so if people want to find out about water issues in my town, they're going to have to come to me. So there's a lot of evolutionary change going on in there, a lot of good journalism by bloggers that I think is going to become mixing and matching.
I think that's where we're going to leave it for tonight with the message from Dory to beware, with an optimistic note from Sally, and with a plea to use the new forms in a way that engage and amplify our democracy. I want to thank Professors Matt Snips and Michelle Elam, Tanya Mitchell, Chris Queen, Dina Montague, and the TAs for the course. I want to thank Dorothy Steele for bringing us together. And I want to especially thank you who weren't required to be here for being with us tonight, and 4 fabulous panelists.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.